The record that started the war wasn't a weapon, it was a sound. Fleet Analyst Sarenvos first encountered it while reviewing atmospheric sensor logs from Earth's outer orbital shell, a low, rhythmic pulse that the survey drones had flagged as anomalous, then dismissed, then flagged again. Not a transmission, not a propulsion signature, not anything the Hegemony's classification library had a word for. The sound occurred every 3.7 seconds, perfectly regular, originating from inside human vessels. Every human vessel, all at once, in unison. She listened to it 7 times before she filed her report. She did not include a conclusion. For the first time in 14 years of service, Sarenvos could not construct one. The sound was biological, and it never stopped. That was 8 months before the million ships arrived, back when the Hegemony still believed Earth was a containment problem, a quarantine case. A civilization that had developed faster than predicted, outpaced its threat window, and now required management before it destabilized the corridor's trade equilibrium. Standard procedure. The Hegemony had done this 43 times across 1,100 years of expansion. The script was written. The outcome was not in question. What no one asked, not the fleet admirals, not the conclave of arbiters, not the strategic calculus division that had modeled Earth's response probability across 6,000 simulations, was why the sound never stopped. Why human hearts never rested. Why they kept beating even while their owners slept. That oversight would cost the Hegemony everything. The first mystery was the sound. The second was the ships. The third, and this one Sarenvos would not discover until it was far too late, was what the humans had been doing for the 8 months in between, while everyone else was busy looking at them. Commander Yale Davin heard the announcement the same way everyone else on the Ardent heard it, through a crackling shipboard comm system that hadn't been properly maintained since the Hegemony's initial blockade cut off their supply lines. Confirmed count, the comms officer said, and his voice was flat in the way voices get when a person has decided that emotion is a resource they cannot currently afford. 1,200,000 Hegemony vessels, outer orbital shell. They've matched our rotation. Yale didn't look up from the table. She was holding a photograph actual printed paper, which was absurd and impractical, and exactly the kind of thing humans kept doing that confused the Hegemony's behavioral models. It was a picture of a coastline, somewhere in what used to be called Croatia. She'd never been there. They're just sitting there, the comms officer added, because silence from a commander was its own kind of pressure, and people always filled it eventually. I know, Yale said. That's not a siege formation. That's not a bombardment array. That's... I know what it is. She set the photograph down. It's a demonstration. They want us to count them. She looked up then, and her crew saw something in her expression that none of them could name precisely. Not calm, not courage, something older than both. Something that looked, to anyone paying close attention, like a person who had already completed the calculation everyone else was still running. Let them count us too, she said quietly. No one asked what she meant, which was either trust or fear, possibly both. Sarenvos was embedded aboard the Hegemony Command Vessel * Perpetual Theorem when the fleet completed its encirclement. She watched the tactical display with the professional interest of a scientist observing an experiment she designed, though she was increasingly aware that something in the data refused to fit her model. Earth's orbital defense grid had gone dark 6 days ago, not destroyed dark. The Hegemony's deep scan arrays confirmed the structures were still physically present, still powered, still technically operational. They had simply stopped responding, all of them, simultaneously, as if the entire planetary defense network had been deliberately placed into some kind of low observable standby mode. Fleet Admiral Dres Karath had interpreted this as surrender, or the prelude to surrender. The humans, faced with 1 million ships, had blinked, had powered down their weapons rather than die pointlessly. It was the rational response. Any civilization confronted with this level of force asymmetry would make the same calculation. They are preparing to negotiate, Dreskareth had said, with the absolute confidence of a being who had never been wrong about anything that mattered. Saren Voss had said nothing. She had pulled up the atmospheric sensor logs instead, scrolling back through 8 months of accumulated data, listening again to that sound. That rhythmic, biological, never-stopping sound. There was something new in the logs. Something that had begun approximately 6 weeks ago and had been growing since. She almost understood what it was. She kept almost understanding it, the way you almost remember a word that lives at the absolute edge of your cognition, present but unreachable. The data said something was changing in Earth's near-orbital environment. The mass readings were fluctuating in a pattern that matched no known physical phenomenon. The fluctuations were small, individually meaningless. But they were occurring at thousands of simultaneous points, distributed across the entire volume of space between Earth and the Hegemony fleet. Distributed, precise, coordinated. She filed a second report, again without conclusion. 3 days later, Dreskareth sent the negotiation ultimatum. The humans did not respond. The silence lasted 11 days. In strategic terms, 11 days is nothing. In psychological terms, it is an eternity specifically engineered to produce maximum institutional anxiety. The Hegemony Conclave had models for human response timelines. The models said a civilization under this level of pressure would respond within 72 hours. When 72 hours passed without communication, the models were revised. When 5 days passed, a second simulation suite was commissioned. When 11 days passed, Dreskareth stopped consulting the models. "They're not negotiating," he said, standing at the tactical display, his 4 upper limbs crossed in the posture his staff had learned to associate with dangerous certainty. "They've decided to force an engagement. They believe their defense grid can absorb initial bombardment while they retaliate with reserve units." "We've confirmed there are no reserve units," one of his staff officers said carefully. "Then they're bluffing." "Sir," Saren Voss's voice was quiet, "may I present an alternative interpretation?" Dreskareth regarded her the way senior commanders regard analysts who have institutional protection but not institutional respect. "You may." "They're not bluffing," she said, "and they're not preparing to fight. I think they're—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat against the console. "I think they're waiting for something to finish." "Finish what?" The question hung in the recycled air of the command bridge. Saren Voss opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her data again. "I don't know yet," she admitted. Dreskareth made a sound that, in his species' emotional vocabulary, meant something close to contemptuous tolerance. "Then I suggest you find out before I lose patience with silence." Yale Davin had been awake for 31 hours when the message came through from the ground teams. She read it once. Then she walked to the viewport and looked at the stars, which currently had 1 million additional stars in them that were not stars, and she thought about the coastline in Croatia that she'd never visited, and she thought about her daughter who was 12 years old and currently sheltering in a repurposed transit station in what used to be called Ankara, and she thought about the specific weight of the decision she was about to make. Then she stopped thinking about all of that, because there was no room for it in the next 72 hours. She turned to her communications officer. "Tell the ground teams to begin Phase 2. Yale. It was her XO, Marcos, who was the only person on the ship who used her first name, because they had known each other for 11 years, and because he had earned it through a series of situations neither of them talked about anymore. "The window is narrower than we modeled." "I know. If Phase 2 goes wrong at the synchronization point." "I know." "Yale, look at me." She turned. His face was doing something complicated. "Is this actually going to work?" She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that contains a full conversation compressed to a single sustained second of eye contact. "It's going to work," she said, "or it's going to be the most expensive lesson the Hegemony ever paid for." "That's not a yes." "No," she agreed, "it's not." Marcos held her gaze for another second, then turned back to his console. Because 11 years. Because the specific arithmetic of trust. "Phase 2, he said to the room. "All stations confirm readiness." The mass fluctuations went critical at 3:47 shipboard time. Saren Voss was still awake. She hadn't slept in 2 days when every sensor array on every vessel in the Hegemony fleet began reporting simultaneously impossible readings. The fluctuations she'd been tracking for weeks, the thousands of small distributed anomalies she'd been unable to classify, were no longer small. They were enormous. They were accelerating, and they were converging. She ran the numbers 3 times, because the first 2 results seemed like software errors. They weren't errors. "Get me the Admiral," she said, and her voice was doing something it had never done before in 14 years of professional composure. It was shaking. She got the Admiral. "Sir?" She projected her data to the command display, hands steady through an act of sheer physical will. "The anomalies I've been tracking, they are not sensor artifacts. They are not a natural phenomenon. They are," she paused because the next word was the word she'd been almost reaching for weeks, and she finally had it, and now that she had it she desperately wished she didn't. "They are infrastructure. The humans have been constructing something, out here, in open space, in the gaps between our vessels." The command bridge went very quiet. "Constructing what?" Drezkareth said. "I don't know the complete structure yet, but the readings suggest." She looked at her display. The numbers had changed again since she'd started talking. "The readings suggest it's already complete." The silence that followed was 5 seconds long. Then every external viewport on the asterisk perpetual theorem went dark. Not dark like powered down. Dark like covered. Like something vast and close and absolutely solid had simply appeared around them, blocking out the stars, blocking out Earth, blocking out everything except each other, and the growing realization that the Hegemony fleet of 1,200,000 vessels was no longer in open space. It was inside something. Here is what Saren Voss understood in the next 14 minutes, assembled from sensor data and inference, and the desperate retroactive application of 8 months of flagged and dismissed reports. The humans had not powered down their orbital defense grid 6 days ago. They had converted it. Piece by piece, component by component, using every civilian industrial asset still operational after the blockade, using production infrastructure hidden inside civilian population, centers that the Hegemony's targeting models had not classified as military because they weren't military when the models were made. They became military in the 8 months between the first fleet deployment and the encirclement. The humans had looked at the Hegemony's timeline, understood exactly how long they had, and used that time not to build weapons, not to build ships, not to prepare a conventional defense. They had built a cage. Not a metaphorical cage, an actual structure, a distributed lattice of interlocking gravitational anchor points, each one individually too small to register as significant, collectively forming an enclosure that now surrounded the entire Hegemony battle fleet at a distance of approximately 300 kilometers from the outermost vessels. The lattice wasn't solid. It was permeable at the individual particle level, which was why nothing in the Hegemony's standard scan protocol had identified it as a unified structure. Permeable at the particle level. Completely, catastrophically impassable at the scale of a spacecraft. The humans had invented an entirely new category of weapon in 8 months. They had done it while pretending to power down. They had hidden it inside civilian infrastructure. And now 1 million Hegemony ships were sitting inside it. "Open a channel to the human command vessel," Drezkareth said. His voice was admirably controlled. His hands were not. "Channel open," the comms officer confirmed. "Silence." Then a human voice, a woman's voice, unhurried, almost quiet, came through the bridge speakers. "Fleet Admiral Drez Karath. This is Commander Yale Davin of the EDF Arden *. I want to be very clear about your current situation before we discuss anything else. You are contained, not captured. The lattice around your fleet is permanent and fully operational. You cannot leave. What happens next is entirely dependent on what you choose to say in the next 5 minutes." Drez Karath's upper limbs uncrossed. He looked at his tactical display, which was showing him confirmation after confirmation that everything she'd said was accurate. "Commander Davin," he said carefully, "you've constructed a significant tactical position, but you have not addressed the fundamental disparity. 1 million ships against whatever you can bring to bear inside this structure." "Your ships can fire," Yale said, and the fact that she didn't raise her voice was somehow worse than if she had. "We know that. We planned for that. What your ships cannot do is maneuver. They cannot form tactical groups. They cannot support each other when they're hit because there's nowhere to fall back to. You have 1 million ships standing perfectly still in a box." A pause. "We have had 8 months to map every one of them." Another pause, shorter. "Do you know what humans do when we have 8 months and a map?" Drez Karath did not answer. He looked at Saren Voss. Saren Voss was looking at her data, and her face had gone through composure and out the other side into something that might have been, in another context, wonder. "We plan," Yale said, and the channel closed. The next 6 hours were the worst of Saren Voss's professional life, and also the most revelatory. She sat with her data, and she understood things in pieces, each piece revealing the edge of a larger piece she hadn't seen. And she documented everything with the methodical obsession of a scientist who has realized she is living inside the most important research event of her species' history and is trying to be equal to it. The lattice was one thing. It was the visible thing. It was the thing you saw when you finally saw it, and it was extraordinary, and she could trace its construction back through her own historical sensor logs and find every step of it in data she had marked as anomalous and not understood. And the experience of that retroactive reconstruction was deeply, physically humbling in a way that had nothing to do with professional pride and everything to do with the sudden terrifying understanding that she had been watching the answer the entire time. But the lattice was not the deepest thing. The deepest thing was in the timing. She pulled up the original survey logs, the ones from before the fleet arrived, from 8 months ago, 7 months ago, 6 months ago. She pulled up the mass fluctuation data from the earliest flagged reports, the ones she dismissed, and she looked at the distribution of the anomaly points, and then she looked at the Hegemony fleet's current positional data, and she ran a comparison that she'd had no reason to run before now, no frame in which it would have been meaningful. The anomaly points from 6 months ago, the future positions of Hegemony vessels, the lattice anchor points. She ran the comparison again. And then she sat completely still for slightly longer than was entirely professional. The lattice anchor points had been placed with reference to the Hegemony fleet's current positions. The humans had known, 6 months ago, within a margin of less than 200 meters, precisely where every ship in the Hegemony fleet would be standing when the encirclement was complete. They had built the cage to fit the ships, not hypothetical ships, not modeled ships. These ships, which meant they had predicted the Hegemony's encirclement strategy, its fleet deployment geometry, its specific vessel positioning protocols, with an accuracy that was not the product of lucky guessing. That was the product of knowing, deeply, specifically knowing. "Admiral," she said, and her voice had found a new register, not calm, not frightened, something that lived between them. "I need to tell you something about the construction timeline." She told him. He listened without interrupting, which he had never done before in their working relationship, which told her he was beginning to understand. "They predicted where we would stand," she finished. That's not possible, Dreskareth said, quietly, like someone who knows the thing they're saying is wrong before they finish saying it. They studied us, Saren Voss said. For years, maybe decades, before we knew they were capable of it, every fleet deployment pattern we used against the 43 previous civilizations, every tactical preference in our command hierarchy, every geometric tendency in how we form encirclements. She pulled up the final comparative display. They built a cage to fit us specifically, not humanity's enemy in general, us, the hegemony, this fleet. The command bridge was silent enough to hear the ventilation system cycling. They knew we were coming, Dreskareth said. Yes. And they let us come. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, why? Saren Voss looked at her data, looked at the lattice, looked at the number of hegemony vessels now sitting motionless inside a structure that humanity had spent 8 months building specifically for them. Because they didn't want to destroy us, she said slowly. They wanted to demonstrate something. She paused. I think they wanted us to understand something. What? She didn't answer immediately, because the answer she was arriving at was a category of answer that required a moment of preparation before you could say it out loud. That they know how we think, she said, better than we think they do, better than they've ever let us see, and that they've known for long enough to build a proof. The engagement Dreskareth ordered lasted 4 hours. Not because he had good options, because a hegemony fleet admiral does not sit in a cage, because institution and pride and the specific weight of authority in a hierarchical military culture sometimes overwrites rational calculation, because he could not accept the alternative, which was the message it sent back to the conclave, which was the message it sent across every other contested system in the corridor. So he fired. And what happened next was not a battle. It was something the hegemony did not have a tactical category for, which was itself a kind of answer to Saren Voss's question. Inside the lattice, with no ability to maneuver, with no tactical geometry possible, with 8 months of human targeting data for every specific vessel in the fleet, the engagement became a precision exercise in asymmetric attrition. The hegemony could fire. The humans had planned for where the shots would go, because the ships couldn't move, and so the shots were predictable, and the humans absorbed what they had to absorb and destroyed what they had chosen to destroy according to a priority list that had been completed 6 weeks ago. The humans were hit. They were hit badly. They lost ships. They lost people. Saren Voss watched the human force take damage that should have broken the engagement, damage that under any rational calculation represented a threshold past which a military commander stops fighting and starts surviving. The humans did not stop. She watched one human vessel take 3 direct impacts in sequence, lose engine capability, lose half its forward structure, go dark for 11 seconds, and then, with the 3-second delay of manual backup systems rerouting through damaged conduits, come back online and resume its engagement role. What are they doing? One of Dreskareth's staff officers said, watching the same thing. Staying, Saren Voss said. They should be withdrawing. There's nowhere to withdraw to, she said. They're inside their own structure. They planned it this way. She watched the damaged human vessel fire again, a 3rd time. They planned to fight from a position where retreat wasn't possible. The staff officer looked at her. Why would anyone plan for that? She thought about the rhythmic sound in the survey logs, the biological one, the one that never stopped. Because they fight better when there's no option, she said quietly. I think they do this to themselves deliberately. Remove the exit so the question of whether to keep going becomes irrelevant. I know. The engagement ended when Dreskareth accepted a ceasefire request from the conclave. Not because the hegemony was losing strategically. The raw attrition numbers still favored them. Because the conclave had seen the engagement data, had seen the targeting precision, had done their own retroactive analysis of the construction timeline and had reached a conclusion that superseded tactical arithmetic. They were not fighting an enemy who had been surprised into a corner. They were fighting an enemy who had designed the corner, invited them into it, and was now demonstrating, with specific and deliberate patience, exactly what the corner cost. Yale Davin read the ceasefire terms from a command chair that had one functional armrest and a crack in the display panel that had been there for 4 months. Around her, her crew was doing the specific and particular kind of work that happens after a sustained engagement, not celebration, not relief, but the methodical processing of cost. Who was injured? Who wasn't there anymore? What was broken? Marcos was standing 3 feet away with a tablet she hadn't asked to see, and he wasn't offering it to her. "How bad?" she said. He looked at the tablet, then at her, then he told her. She was quiet for a long time. "Okay," she said. The word was very small. It was also the only word available. "The conclave's terms include a full withdrawal," Marcos said. "All fleet units to the outer boundary of the corridor. A non-interference zone around Earth and current human-settled systems, establishment of formal diplomatic recognition. And the lattice. They want it dismantled." She looked out the viewport at the stars, which still had 1,000,000 additional ones in them, but now the 1,000,000 additional ones were very still and waiting. "Tell the conclave," she said, "that the lattice isn't coming down." Marcos blinked. "Yale. It's the proof of concept. If it comes down, in 5 years some faction of the conclave decides we dismantled it because we couldn't maintain it, decides we got lucky. The cage stays. It's a monument." She paused. "They can look at it from the outer boundary." Marcos was quiet for a moment. "That's going to complicate the negotiation." "Good," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, and was the specific register of a person who has spent everything and intends to ensure the expenditure was not wasted. Complicated keeps them thinking. The negotiation lasted 60 days. Saren Voss spent those 60 days writing a report that was eventually 612 pages long. She wrote it with the same systematic precision she brought to every analysis, but also with something extra, something that was not strictly professional, that crept into the language in ways her editors later struggled with. Because she had been there. Because she had heard that sound in the original survey logs and not understood it. Because she had watched the engagement data in real time and felt, for the first time in her career, the specific quality of being genuinely outthought by something she had been trained to consider secondary. The report's most quoted section, eventually, was not about the lattice, not about the targeting data or the construction timeline or the fleet encirclement prediction. It was the section she almost didn't include because it was the hardest to quantify and she was a quantitative analyst. It was about the damaged human vessel, the one that had taken 3 hits, gone dark for 11 seconds and come back online. She had pulled the communications logs from that vessel after the ceasefire, reconstructed the 11 seconds of darkness from backup system recordings. In those 11 seconds, with the ship going dark, with the crew experiencing complete systems failure in an active engagement inside an enclosed structure with 1,000,000 enemy vessels, the internal audio logs recorded 3 things. Someone was crying. Someone was issuing repair commands in a voice that was completely steady. The same someone between commands continued crying. Not instead, not after, during. Saren Voss had read this data point 8 times before she understood what she was looking at. Because in the Hegemony military doctrine, and in the doctrines of 37 other spacefaring civilizations she'd studied, fear and function occupied separate cognitive channels. You managed fear first, then acted. Or you suppressed fear and acted. The 2 states were understood as sequential or mutually exclusive. The human was doing both simultaneously. Crying and commanding, falling apart and holding together, not sequentially, not alternating. simultaneously. She wrote 3 pages about it. Then she cut it to 1 paragraph because she didn't have the framework to say more. Then she put the 3 pages back because the absence of framework was the point. The report's final line, which became the most quoted sentence in hegemony strategic literature for the next 300 years, was not a conclusion. It was a question. If they can do this to themselves without stopping, and they are still only at the beginning of what they are willing to become, what are we preparing ourselves to understand? Yale Davin was planetside when the last hegemony vessel crossed the outer boundary, standing on actual ground, which she hadn't done in 11 months. Concrete beneath her, wind from the west, the kind of pale morning light that does not care about galactic politics and falls on everything equally. Her daughter found her there, 12 years old and 3 inches taller than the last time, which was not something Yale had been prepared for, the specific violence of how much time becomes visible in a child's height. They stood for a moment without speaking. "Did we win?" her daughter asked. Yale looked at the sky, clear blue, no additional stars. "We're still here," she said. "The cage is still up." "That's not the same as winning." "No," Yale agreed. "It's better than winning. It means they have to keep thinking about it." She paused. "Every time one of their vessels approaches the boundary, they see it. They know we built it in 8 months while pretending to give up. They know we predicted them." She was quiet for a second. "That lives in them now." Her daughter thought about this. Children consider things fully before they speak, when they haven't yet learned to perform consideration without performing it. "What if they figure out something about us?" she said. "Something we didn't expect them to figure out." Yale looked at her daughter, thought about the analyst's report, which she'd read twice on the transit back down, the part about the 11 seconds of darkness, the simultaneous crying and commanding, the paragraph that admitted there was no framework available. "Then we figure out something new," she said. "But what if?" "Then we figure out something newer." She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "That's the thing they don't have a model for. We don't stop at the point where figuring out new things gets uncomfortable." She paused. "They expected us to reach a limit. Every civilization they've managed reached a limit. Some limit where the cost was too high and the rational thing was to accept the outcome." The wind came again from the west. "We just don't have that limit built in," she said. "It's not stubbornness. It's not bravery. It's just—" She searched for the word and settled for honesty. "We've been doing impossible things for so long that we forgot to build a ceiling on what's possible." Her daughter leaned against her. Below them, the city moved in the specific way that cities move when they have been frightened, and now the fear is becoming something else. Not safety, not certainty, but the particular forward-leaning motion of a population that has discovered it can endure more than it thought and is now, quietly, taking stock. The lattice is still there. 300 years later, every civilization in the corridor knows it. The hegemony, which has long since evolved past the institutional structure that ordered the encirclement, maintains a research station on the outer boundary where xenoarchaeologists study the construction methodology and argue about the implications. Younger civilizations make pilgrimages to view it. There is a significant body of philosophical literature across 11 species that takes the lattice as its central artifact, not as a symbol of human aggression, not as a monument to military ingenuity, but as a question asked in gravitational physics and left permanently open. The question is this: if you watched us build it and did not understand what you were watching, what else are you watching right now that you do not understand? Saranvas's report, all 612 pages of it, is required reading in the Hegemony's strategic education curriculum. The 3-page section on the 11 seconds of darkness, the section she almost cut, the one she put back because the absence of framework was the point, is the section most cited by non-human commanders when they are asked to explain why humanity, 3 centuries later, remains the civilization that changes equations by existing in them. It isn't the lattice that concerns them in the end. It isn't the targeting data, or the construction timeline, or the eerie accuracy with which humanity predicted a fleet deployment geometry derived from 1,000 years of undefeated hegemony military doctrine. It's the person in the 11 seconds, crying and commanding, holding together and falling apart, both at the same time in the dark. Because every civilization that has ever reviewed those audio logs does the same thing Saren Voss did. They read it once, then read it again, then sit with it for slightly longer than is professionally warranted. Because what the logs describe is not a coping mechanism, not a failure of emotional regulation, not an accident of human neurochemistry. It is a species that evolved to function deepest when it is most broken. That keeps its grip tightest when it has the most reasons to let go. That is not limited by suffering because suffering became, somewhere in the long grinding history of their small and resilient planet, simply another condition under which humans do what humans do. They continue. The galaxy has many species stronger than humanity. Older, faster, more logical, more durable. Species that can process more information, withstand more radiation, survive more vacuum, endure more gravity. The galaxy has species that are, by every measurable metric, superior organisms. What the galaxy does not have, what 300 years of expanding contact has failed to find elsewhere, is another species that responds to the moment it should stop by simply not knowing how. The lattice drifts in the dark between stars, gravitational anchor points holding their precise positions to within 2 meters of their original placement, monuments to a calculation that was completed before the fleet arrived. Hegemony research vessels pass it on their regular survey routes. Their crew members look at it through viewports with a feeling their species' emotional vocabulary has never quite finished building a word for. Something between reverence and the specific, vertiginous discomfort of knowing there is a mind in the universe that thought of you before you thought of it. And somewhere on the other side of that lattice, on a small and unremarkable planet under pale morning light, humanity is looking out at the stars and planning for something. The rest of the galaxy doesn't know what yet. The rest of the galaxy has learned to find that terrifying, and has learned, even more slowly, even more reluctantly,